We live in a strange world. As you sit in your car in front of your job and scroll through your phone, you try to preserve just a few moments for yourself before you have to let go. But it's never enough time, because you don't really work for yourself. You work for the system. As soon as you come home, you begin to shop online, because this is how you feel you can express your true self. But is it really yourself? Or has the algorithm just learned what colors make you click?
The spread of the coronavirus. The World Health Organization says the risk of the virus expanding worldwide is now classified as very high, and there are new cases of the disease here in the United States.
The pandemic began, and all the experts you have been told to listen to all your life knew nothing. And the world as you knew it was an illusion. In the midst of a time in history filled with uncertainty, politicians continue to divide your family and friends. Your personal information has become commodified by corporations, and economic and environmental crises are an imminent threat. This is a film about how millennials, Gen Z, and future generations have inherited a broken and troubled world from past generations. This story begins at a moment in time in September of 1945. It was a series of events that shaped the psychology of individuals for generations and still impacts society today. In 1945, the Allied powers had become successful in stopping the radical forces that had come to power in Europe and Japan. After 6 years of total war, the destruction had come to an end. The calamitous events experienced over these turbulent decades had an effect on the individuals that experienced them that psychiatrists had not yet come to understand. These individuals would become known as the GI generation.
The victory won in the West must now be won in the East. The whole world must be cleansed of the evil from which half the world has been freed.
The Americans emerged from World War II with incredible optimism as a new world power. The unprecedented growth of the U.S. economy translated into prosperity. The politicians saw this as an opportunity. They believed that instead of expanding the economy by conquering other nations for their resources as they had in the past, they could instead expand internally through idealizing consumption. But there was a problem. After a decade and a half of wrenching depression and war, consumers were cautious about spending their savings in war bonds they had gladly accumulated. And then, something extraordinary happened.
Through the arts and crafts of the American stylists, the things about us are made to express our own free spirits and desires for the colorful things that spell sheer fun, expressing not only the American love of beauty, but also the basic freedom of the American people, which is the freedom of individual choice.
With a sense of relief, escapism was fully embraced by the GI generation as they had finally evaded several catastrophic events. For the many who had returned from the Second World War, this was the time to settle down and start a family. Newfound optimism in the American dream and emerging technologies sparked an incredible surge in population. The baby boomer generation had arrived. They would be driven by a new ideology, one that centered around consumption. Never before had the world seen such an expansion in population in such a short time. Because the older generation had more frugal spending habits, the politicians began to convey the post-war message that mass consumption was not a personal indulgence. It was a civic responsibility designed to improve the living standards of all Americans. So the parents began spending their money on the boomers. The boomers quickly gained the attention of every advertiser in the nation. But advertisers had to come up with newer and better ways to target the up-and-coming generation. In order to accomplish this, they turned to new and radical developments in psychology. And what they discovered was a powerful way to see the world. B.F. Skinner was a psychologist who throughout the mid-century had realized that the old theories in psychology were out of touch. He saw that psychiatrists were focusing far too much on the inner thoughts and personality of human behavior that they could not control. By contrast, he believed that the environment around a being had just as much, if not more, power in the shaping of an individual's behavior. And he was able to prove this new theory by experimenting on pigeons.
I'm going to use this switch to operate the magazine, to reinforce the pigeon for doing something, and you will, I trust, see this effect on the pigeon. Now, if I were just to hand the pigeon some food, that would be a delayed sort of reinforcement, but instead the pigeon has been already conditioned to turn and go and eat when this light flashes and when the sound of the magazine is heard. Suppose I shape up the behavior of making a complete turn. What I do is simply, as I did then, to wait for some part of that behavior. There we go, all the way around.
Skinner found that by adding or taking away stimuli from the environment of a living being, you could increase or decrease the frequency of the desired behavior. It was extraordinary. He called his new behavior theory operant conditioning. Academics feared what chaos this new science was capable of creating in the hands of the wrong people. And then, a technology unlike what anyone had seen before gave the advertisers the perfect vehicle to use this new and powerful concept. Without hesitation, television quickly stormed into the lives of the American people. But this seemingly harmless new technology was hazardous in ways that society could not yet see. The boomers were becoming the first generation to be targeted by conditioning of advertisement and political propaganda directly in their homes, at a level never seen before.
It's a tremendous self-educational device to make you more alert, make you more capable of spotting the psychological techniques and the polished phrases and the other clever gimmicks that override the consumer's rationality level and probe deep into the emotional and status psychology which the ad is aimed at in order to promote these purchases.
Advertisers began to reinforce buying behaviors to the boomers through television by appealing to their primal desires for things like social belonging and success. They would do this by using the behavioral concepts of imitation, in particular by utilizing people who had a great deal of fame. By doing this, they created personalities that the everyday consumer could relate to or aspire to become. This would ultimately shape the way the boomers saw the world for the rest of their lives.
I think it's highly possible that advertising encourages people to consume more than they actually need for survival. I don't think there's any question about that. But I am not sure that all by itself is indeed a bad thing.
For the generations prior to the boomers, rigor was the dominant practice for American children until a man named Benjamin Spock changed things. Dr. Benjamin Spock was a trained physician with a specialty in pediatrics. He had produced a series of books that advocated ideas about parenting that were at the time considered to be unorthodox. The Common Sense Book of Baby was particularly influential to the parents, a bestseller of tremendous proportions. The book sold 500,000 copies in its first 6 months, and in the half-century following its printing was surpassed only by the Bible in sales. Several generations of parents were being persuaded to be more flexible and affectionate with their children, and to treat them as individuals. But Dr. Spock had ignored researchers that criticized these ideas for relying too heavily on anecdotal evidence rather than serious academic research, which stated that permissive parenting could lead to a number of negative outcomes.
Democracy, every citizen is supposed to inform himself and use his influence as much as possible. I also see a connection between raising children in to be healthy, happy citizens, and then make a world in which they can stay alive. And what I mean is, I think that there's at least a 25% of chance of war with China, for instance, within the next few months.
Scientists had warned parents that children raised by excessively permissive parents tended to lack self-discipline, possess poor social skills, and may become self-involved and demanding over time. But the book would become incredibly influential, because what Dr. Spock did was give a powerful feeling the parents had lost during their youth, which they could now give to their children. What the advertisers and Dr. Spock had helped create was a culture of permissiveness and egotism that was beginning to express itself through the baby boomer generation. Through the thick fog that was created by consumerism, there was a crimson-colored fear in the back of the minds of the Americans. They were told of an existential threat looming over them. The cities, the suburbs, the young, the old, and all the fruits of American society were in danger. The advances of communism around the world convinced many U.S. citizens to fear the growth of new radical movements in the East and lean into what made them American. And the politicians fueled this existential fear by demonizing the opposition even further through the media. Elected officials from both major parties sought to portray themselves as staunch anti-communists and peddled the vision of a moral world on America's terms. Few dared to criticize the questionable tactics that were used to persecute suspected radicals or spies. But even if this mass hysteria had derived from an exaggeration, it revealed a powerful anger that was building up under the surface of the American dream. Today, when historians tell the story of the 1960s and 70s counterculture, it's looked back upon as a single movement of young, progressive-minded hippies who fought for civil rights and united in protest against the Vietnam War. And somewhere along the way, this new movement had discovered that love, sexuality, and drugs could stretch the limits of the human mind beyond the twisted reality of the corporate world. And everyone believed it to be true. The counterculture was in fact two separate movements. First, in the early 60s, the New Left, who wanted change in politics, protested the Vietnam War, and fought for civil rights led by generations prior to the boomers. Then, in the 1970s, the young adults in the baby boom generation had saw this new movement and sought to have a movement of their own. They wanted to change the world by changing their minds and their consciousness and to focus inward on themselves as they rejected the patronizing authority of the government and their parents. All with the help of a powerful new hallucinogen called LSD. They became known as the New Communalists, a radical and anti-social movement, where which image became preeminent because nothing deeper was going on ideologically. Up to this point, the boomers had grown up in a world where their parents and grandparents, especially the wealthiest of them, paid taxes at significantly higher levels than they do today. These taxes kept public colleges unusually affordable and funded the vast national highway system. The New Communalist boomers were mostly young, white, educated men that set out into the new highways into the woods to build communities under their rule.
And I traveled around for a long time, about 8 months, 9 months. And I lived in a lot of different cities. I lived at a lot of different colleges. I lived at Harvard and I lived in Berkeley, and that's about the two weirdest colleges. And I think I got into that a little bit, seeing where those guys were at, the smart people in the country. And I met a lot of the professors and stuff. But I still didn't think they were where it's at, because they were still out for like academic privileges and to get farther up in academic, And the students were just liking to get in a good job still. A lot of them were smoking dope and taking LSD and even taking heroin. It's funny that students at Harvard took heroin.
Achieving a higher level of consciousness via drugs was a central tenet of the hippie movement, but the abundant availability of drugs resulted in overdosing and crime. Women and blacks were largely disallowed from having any substantial position within commune life, a trait that had potentially been learned from social structures in their childhood, a contradiction to the popular image of a 1970s hippie. Still conditioned by rampant advertising of the 50s, the New Communalists were rather driven with the discovery and use of new technologies, particularly a focus on cybernetics and systems of power. But the desire for new technology and commune life were too much of a conflict, and the technophilic hippies from the baby boom quietly retreated back to the cities. Simply by negating the social distinction for new communalism, the historians largely left the movement overlooked, or it was asserted as an unimportant blip in the radar of outcasts that represented the larger known revolutionary movement of the New Left. These previous adventures or escapes from taxation remain with us as a caricature of the hippie, and the LSD helped us secure this alternate reality into a colorful one.
Out of the big cities, out of contact with the government, away from the coercive agencies of government, police, engineering boards, city planners, city governments, tax collectors, and it can be done.
Quasi-radical boomer groups during the New Communalism hippie movement had vaguely overlapping sensibilities. The Krishnas, the Black Panthers, Doves, Stoners, Acid Heads, hippies, yippies, all had one thing in common. What these groups had shared was an enemy. What hippies called the man, or the system, or the establishment, could be better described as the technocracy, the scientific managerial approach that sustained a hyper-organized industrial society that was modern America up until the 1980s. In their eyes, the technocratic government was a relic who had been in power for far too long. But the government and the older generations up to this point had grown the country into the prosperous nation that it was. In the 1950s and the 1960s, when the economy was booming, the wealthiest Americans paid the top income tax rates. Relief for unemployment was widely available, and the financial systems were reformed to prevent a repeat depression. The gap between the rich and the poor had never been more narrow, and the boomers hated it. They were biting the hand that fed them because it wasn't enough. The technocrats and the politicians despised the boomers through the 70s. They saw them as spoiled and unappreciative of what society had given them. But that would soon change.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
By the 1980s, the social disturbances of the past decades had prompted a backlash by religious leaders who advocated a return to basic family values. A new movement of white evangelicalism awakened among the boomers, one that was socially conservative and hostile to the agenda of progressive thought. The desires of the massive boomer population was and would continue to be unfettered liberation, free from regulation in every way possible. Hatred for the government and restraint of any kind became the driving force for the generation who had now become the largest voting bloc. Politicians began to influence what they called the moral majority of boomer evangelicals as they used the same techniques the advertisers had used in the past, by feeding their desires for acceptance and consumption. One man understood the desire better than anyone and promised them to be the politician they had always hoped for. President Reagan's staunch anti-communism and his calls for limited government were a perfect fit for the conditioning instilled deep within the boomer cohort. Even the massive evangelical boomer population closed their eyes to his failed attempts at family values. Twice married, alienated from his children, and almost never attended church, all antithetical to what they considered a virtuous life. For the first time, in any significant way, evangelicalism had become interlocked with the Republican Party, and the boomers were at the wheel. For the boomers that hadn't joined the new religious political movement, their search for individualism, which began in the counterculture, would come to a confusing end, and they realized that in order to truly challenge the systems in power and achieve higher consciousness, they would have to turn to the very thing they detested. They believed that in order to change the system, they must become a part of it. And from the desires of the technophilic new communalists, who had attempted to create their own societies and systems, came a profound new technology called the internet. For them, this would be the ultimate freedom from government they had always desired. From the 80s to the 90s, the boomers would abandon the environmentalism that had inspired them in their younger years in trade for a complete laissez-faire deregulation of corporations that would slowly destroy the environment. The politicians would have to pander to the desires of the boomers to abolish taxation of their growing wealth, and deregulation of the economy in the name of individualism would give the banks the freedom to control the markets as they wish. Consumption and growth was the ultimate goal, with complete disregard for what could come from such decadence. But then, unexpectedly, the magical dream they created collapsed. The terrorist attack on September 11th was a direct retaliation to the radical individualism that had started in America and had taken over the world. An individualistic phenomenon that was born from optimism in the end of one radical movement had created another radical movement that brought the American dream to its knees more than 50 years later, and in the process took the illusion of freedom the boomers had created and left behind a world cloaked in an impenetrable darkness. In the modern world, the millennial generation make the majority of today's workforce and work longer hours than any other generation in the last 100 years for less pay. Anti-intellectualism and distrust in experts has become ingrained in society, stemming from the anti-establishment traditions of the past, an epistemological threat that has perpetuated a pandemic. Politicians have exempted taxes for the richest individuals, and as a result, the wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families has doubled from 1989 to 2016. The cyber world created by the new communalist boomers, with the hopes to be the ultimate example of freedom, has become monopolized by the algorithms of the very corporations they allowed to grow uncontrollably, and the environment is slowly withering as a result of overconsumption. The boomers inherited some of the lightest intergenerational burdens in American history, and will leave some of the greatest for the youth. As a result, we might all die. The question is, how slowly and how painfully?